Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi Dr. Brutt. Although a bit belated, and we have people who have reached out to us, where is the discussion about the Seforim Moed Katan? So here we are. Let's discuss today the name of the Masechta we find in Reshonim, who call it by another name. We're going to discuss about Rashi. If you have the new Eis V'Hadar Gemara, you see there's a Rashi in Ksav Yad, which to me has been very helpful. We're going to discuss Reshonim. We're going to have a discussion today about Machon, Harry Fishel. We're also going to discuss Chol Hamoed, Shemitah. However, very important, the discussions about the Seforim and Avelos, and whether the discussion out there about people who are mefakfek and learning Moed Katan because it's Avelos, talks about Misa. That's a mitzvah going to be a separate discussion, which we hope to be able to provide in the next week or two. Rabbi Brutt, how are you today?
Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem.
Okay, so let's get going with the name of the Masechta.
Okay, so first we have, most people know the Masechta as its name, Moed Katan. However, we find that some people refer to it as Masechtas Mashkin. Okay, now, so first, one, Ramatesyo's Trashon points to a Rambam that refers to it as, I think he says that the Rambam refers to it in some places as Masechtas Mashkin, but the Ali Tamar, from which I've quoted in the past on Moed Katan, he has a piece where he shows that it's possible, some people actually called it even Moed, not as Moed Katan, not as Mashkin. Okay, however, the question is, I'm mentioning that people call it Mashkin. Who calls it Mashkin, and what is even the significance of calling it Mashkin? So, as interesting as it is, as boring as it might sound, a fellow, Yaakov Spiegel, wrote a book, wrote many books actually, but one of his books is called Amudim Betolda Sefer Havri. Just to see it, it looks like this. And in one of the volumes, he has a bunch of pages where he literally checked how numerous Rishonim refer to the Masechta. And he comes to the conclusion that Ashkenaz Rishonim, many of them call it Moed Katan, Provence Rishonim call it Moed Katan, Svarg Rishonim, some call Moed Katan. Sometimes you'll find that they do call it Mashkin, as I mentioned earlier, where Maseches Rashon points to some Rambams. And then he says that the people we do find, for example, Rishonim of Italy, they many times refer to it as Mashkin. Okay, you'll ask me, why in the world is this important? I'll just mention very briefly. Sometimes, especially in more recent years, you want to uncover, we find a manuscript and we don't know who it is. Doesn't have any, but it's believed to be a Rishon. We don't know, we simply don't, it doesn't say on the manuscript who it was or who wrote it. So people who try to figure this out, they try to look for all types of clues to identify the author. Sometimes these type of clues could help narrow down the search. For example, if let's say we see that the whole time he's referring to Moed Katan as Mashkin, it might help to look, he might be an Italian Rishon, and then somehow through that it might narrow down the searches to figure it out. But okay, this is just a side point, just to begin the discussion of today about Moed Katan.
Okay, excellent. So now let's get to Rashi. I know we had a discussion about Rashi when we were discussing Maseches Tainis, but I think in Moed Katan the discussion is a little more in depth and more wide-ranging.
Correct. So to say at the outset, I am definitely not going to spend the next 2 hours to speak and mention all the different possibilities and the back and forths about it, but I will try in the next few minutes to briefly mention some of the highlights of the discussions about this fascinating question. Okay, so the first thing to mention is that as opposed to any other Masechta, there are other Masechtas, we discussed Tainis earlier, that there's discussions about it, but this Moed Katan has the most discussion about it, with different possibilities about it, who it could be, which we'll see right now. And not only that, many people feel that they actually did find the right Rashi on Moed Katan, whereas, let's say, some other Masechtas, where once it became proven that it's not necessarily Rashi, they never found the Rashi on the Masechta, which could mean that he didn't write it on those Masechtas. Anyway, here are the basic ideas about this topic. Number one, the printing press was first invented in the 1440s. The first Talmud was printed pretty much as a whole Talmud was by Cincino in the 1480s. Then the next time the whole Gemara is printed is by Bramberg in the 1520s, and Masechtas Moed Katan is printed in 1521 or 1522. Okay. Right away, both of these shasin that existed, they included Rashi. Where did they get Rashi from? Okay, so there were existing manuscripts that were out there that they made sure to use when they were printing their various Talmuds. Now, for hundreds of years, no one said boo about Rashi on Moed Katan. So far, the earliest that I'm able to discover that someone even says anything about it, that it's problematic, it might not be him, is the Radal. The Radal, Radavid Luria, in his Perkei Rebbe Lezer, he has an amazing Hagdama, a few different Hagdamas. In the middle of a discussion, he says Rashi on the Rif is the real Rashi on Moed Katan, and what's on the Gemara is not Rashi, but it's a different parish from an Ashkenazi Rishon. That's what he says. He does not explain why. He says that in my notes on Moed Katan I explain more about it, but sadly we don't have his notes on Moed Katan. Okay. Now the Netziv in Emek Sheila also says like you should know, at least two places I found, he says that the Rashi on Moed Katan is not on the side of the Gemara is not Rashi, whereas the Rashi on the Rif is Rashi. I'll explain it in a minute, drop more about this. And so too, another person, we'll discuss more about him shortly, Rabbi Yehuda Epstein, he also, in his Sefer Minchas Yehuda, he comes to the same conclusion. Then he says, I came across the Radal. Now, I'm not sure what it is that, because none of them elaborate why, and why is it that no one up till this period of time of the 1850s said anything about it. So much so that even a drop earlier than the 1850s, a work that only came to print in the early 1900s, but it was written by someone that was a chaver of the Pas HaShulchan, and he was in Eretz Yisrael with the Pas HaShulchan, that would date him, that this work seemed to have been written in the 1830s. And he talks about a topic which we'll also, Meretz Hashem, discuss later on today, about shaving on Chol Hamoed. In the middle of right away in the beginning of his conversation, where he wrote this small little chibur on the topic, he starts talking about Rashi on Moed Katan, and he says, Rashi, you have to be medayik in every single word, every letter of Rashi, because we know there's nothing extra in Rashi, and it's ein l'davar soif how deep it is. So it's ironic that he says those words on Rashi on Moed Katan. So it seems no one really knew before the 1850s anything about that there's problems with Rashi. Now, another interesting source is the Keren Eira, who also wrote a very important work on Moed Katan. Derech Agav, he's talking about a Rashi, and he says maybe it's a Toy Sefer, and then he says maybe you could fix the Toy Sefer, and then he says I'm Rashi in the Rif, and he doesn't explain anything like why is he showing you the Rashi in the Rif. Now, just now to elaborate or drop more. In general, we know everyone opens up the Gemara and you see that in the back there's Rashi on the Rif. Now, somebody even asked me, what is Rashi on the Rif? So for most Masechtas, it's not considered a Rashi. Rashi didn't write on the Rif. It seems that in most Masechtas, that at some point in time, in the late Reshonim period of time, Rif became more used than Gemara. People were learning Rif, not Gemara. Sometimes some people attribute it to the fact that there were burnings of Talmud and Rif was allowed to be around, so they adapted so they took Rashi and they didn't bring all of Rashi, but they took parts of Rashi that related to the Rif, and some people, we don't even know who they are, and they put it around the Rif. But in general, it's a question if we rely on it, how reliable is it? Was it completely tampered? But for some reason, Moed Katan, as I'm telling you, the Radal, the Netziv, the Minchas Yehuda, they say Rashi on the Rif on Moed Katan is real Rashi. Now, I don't know how they know that, but that's what they say. Okay. Another interesting point is that, which will also play out soon, is the Maratz Chayas, who we said by Masechtas Tainus, he was the first person to say that Tainus might not be Rashi. He says that if you look in the Ein Yankov, also you'll see a lot of pieces of Rashi that he does not find in the Rashi and the printed Shas Vilna. Actually, he didn't use the Shas Vilna before, but it's not there. What's going on? So he's also pointing out that there's different Rashis, that the printed one on the side of your Gemara that I'm saying is already from the first printings of Cincino and Bamberg, and they're not. They're in the Ein Yankov in the name of Rashi, because the Ein Yankov, when he wrote his Pirush, he put on the side Rashi, but he doesn't. But a lot of his Rashis that he has is not going to be found in your standard Rashi on the Masechta. Okay, he just points it out. He doesn't know what's pshat. Okay, fast forward 2 years later, after the Radal, we said is 1852. A fellow named Yaakov Reifman writes a whole article in German, and he says that Rashi on Moed Katan is not Rashi. Who does he say it is? Rabbeinu Gershom Meragayla, the famous Rabbeinu Gershom Meragayla, one of the Gedolei early Reshonim, and he lists out his proofs in this article written in German, and that's 1854. Okay, a few years go by, and a fellow named David Ber Zember, who was a Talmud of the Aruch LaNer, writes a small booklet where he discusses Rashi on the Darim and on Moed Katan. He comes out against this Reifman, and he concludes that Rashi on the Rif on this Masechta is the real Rashi, but he says the Rashi on the side of the Gemara is also real Rashi. It's just an earlier version, so all the problems that might come up, it's not such a big deal. Rashi updated his Pirush. That's the one on the Rif. So the Rif, when you open up your Gemara and you use the Rif Rashi, that's the most updated Rashi, whereas the one on the side of your Gemara, that's Rashi, but it's an earlier edition. Okay, this is going with an assumption that many people have, that Rashi wrote various additions to his Pirush. Okay. Now, this is, I said, is in 1867. 1869, Reb Nosson David Rabinovich, the Baal Diktukei Seforim, put out his work of Diktukei Seforim on Masechtas of Beya, and then around then he also did Moed Katan and Chagiga. In the introduction, he says, as a matter of, he doesn't say why, but he says, by the way, Rashi, what do I use for Rashi on this Masechta Moed Katan? I use a Pirush from Rabbeinu Gershom that I have, and he uses a manuscript, and he also says that what we have on the side is not Rashi in the standard versions of your regular Gemara. That is written by who? Rabbeinu Gershom. This is a similar conclusion to what I said earlier from Yaakov Reifman. But he says this himself. Okay, comes along this Dov Ber Zember, and he writes a whole book, a small book, and he's very sharp against Nosson David Rabinovich. They have to understand, they don't just write a claim. They literally go through all the Rashis on the Masechta, pointing out all different problems, and he's very upset. And he says, I don't understand. First of all, it's not true. It's really Rashi. And then he's also upset that the Diktukei Seforim doesn't even bother to mention his work. He says, you know me, and whatever. Okay. The Diktukei Seforim writes back about it, and he ends up writing also a small work about this subject to prove his method. And he says that anyone who reads Rashi on Moed Katan, it's a matter of a feel. If you're familiar with Rashi, you will be able to pick up. It's not the same language as Rashi and Ganshas. Obviously, not everyone is able to do that, but let's say someone like the Diktukei Seforim and others, they had this chush they were able to pick up. It's not Rashi. Nothing more to discuss. It's not Rashi. Is it someone close to Rashi? Maybe, yeah, but it's not Rashi. Rashi had a certain amazing kayach of ksiva that no one was able to mimic. They even say, there's an old Messiah everyone heard growing up this, I'm sure, that they say that Rashi's Einiklach said that we could mimic, I think Rabbeinu Tam said it, or if not the Rashbam said it, one of them said, to mimic Rashi's Pirush on Chumash we could, but Rashi on Shas, impossible. I think, but maybe I'm mixing it up. But anyway, the point is that Rashi's Pirush on Shas is impossible. It's written, and it's a unique thing. No Rishon was ever able to come to write such a unique Pirush with such a. Part of the uniqueness is also with such a small amount of words to the exact points. Anyway, the Diktukei Seforim says, sorry, I disagree with you. And then he apologizes to him for not mentioning him in his work, and that's beyond the scope of this thing, but fine. So far we've reached to, at this point, we're holding in 1869, and we have a few different opinions out there what's going on. Fine. Fast forward. The question is, what in the world is the Dikduke Seforim referring to when he says it's Rabbeinu Ger Shemer Goyla? What's going on over here? So if you open up your Shas Vilna, you'll see in various Masechtas and Shas, they have on the side a Pirush called Rabbeinu Ger Shemer Goyla. What happened is the Shas Vilna, when they were printing the Shas, they want to get you to buy their Shas. So they went and they hunted down Peirushim of all types, Reshonim and Achronim, that they could find in various places, in various collections. L'mashal Rabbeinu Chananel, they put on the side. And so too, Rabbeinu Ger Shemer Goyla. They tracked it down and they put it on certain Masechtas on the side. This is in the 1880s. Comes along 1896, and a fellow, a very learned person, Avram Epstein, he writes an in-depth article in German where he says it's not Rabbeinu Ger Shemer Goyla. And who is it? He calls it Pirush Megenza, which basically means Talmidim of this of Rabbeinu Ger Shemer Goyla, but it's not Rabbeinu Ger Shemer Goyla. He outlines this, a very in-depth article. Luckily, I don't read German, but it was translated into Hebrew a few years back, and you can read it easily in this Hebrew version. It was printed in a journal called Netuim. Okay, now his findings were accepted today that Peirushim that are under the name Rabbeinu Ger Shemer Goyla are really Pirush Megenza, it's called. Okay, but it's not far away from Rashi. This is basically a generation before Rashi. People that Rashi could have even met some of them, are people that are writing these Peirushim on some of the Masechtas, and one such Masechta is Moed Katan, what we have on the side of our Gemara. Okay, some people throw out, it could be Avram Epstein throws this out as a possibility. Others run with this later on. Some people go with this. It might really be Rabbi Yochum. Others say maybe Rabbi Yochum was involved with the Pirush, but it's not strictly Rabbi Yochum. It's a bunch of people writing it, whatever it is. Okay. But it's not Rabbeinu. But the point is, at this point, we're holding that in 1896, the conclusion is it's not Rabbeinu Ger Shemer Goyla, but it's an Ashkenaz Pirush that is a little before Rashi. Okay, fine. Fast forward to 1939, a great Talmud Chacham named Ramar Chazak, so he prints a Pirush and he calls it Pirush Masechtas Mashkin, which is, we already mentioned the name of one of the Rishonim, and then he writes in his Akdama, I now found this is the real Rashi on Moed Katan. Okay. And he proves it based on various proofs of introduction, like people do in their introduction. Comes along Rav Shlomo Yosef Zevin in his book reviews that came out, I believe, 2 years later, around that time, and he writes that it's a great Pirush. He's not buying into the fact that it's Rashi. You don't have enough proof that it's Rashi. He's Malamed, it's Chus. Maybe it is Rashi if you go with Hanacha that Rashi wrote many Maduras. Maybe it's a Madura of Rashi, but he's not going with that. Okay, fine. Great. So now we're holding 1939. Another possibility has been thrown out there. Fine. Fast forward to 1961. In 1961, a Talmud, a Chashav, a Talmud of Ramei Arik, but then he, to put it mildly, went different ways. World War II tragedies also got involved with that. His name was Ephraim Kufafer, a tremendous Talmud Chacham who was prolific, wrote a lot in Polish about Yiddish history, Jewish history, and also in Hebrew, printed tons of manuscripts. He discovered in 1961 what he claimed to be the Rashi on Masechtas Moed Katan. He found this based on a manuscript that he worked in the manuscript room in Hebrew University, and he proves Barichos in his Akdama based on various things, such as many quotes of Reshonim in the name of Rashi on the Masechta that are not found in the Rashi on the side of the Gemara, are found in this manuscript. And he has other proofs, and he comes to the conclusion in 1961, I found Rashi. Now, this Rashi, for example, so it's not only this academic, Ephraim Kufafer holds like this. Rav David Tzvi Hillman, was a famous person, legendary Talmud Chacham that was a Kanoi, but he was prolific also. He's one of the people that worked on various projects, such as the Shapsi Frankel Rambam, the Maseches, and the text. He was a big bucky and all different things. Tremendous Talmud Chacham, put out many Rishonim. He went through very carefully the Rashi Moed Katan. He says Rashi Moed Katan is not a Rashi. He comes to the conclusion he says it might even be Amaretz was the one who worked on it because there's too many steers. We say the final editor. We say it could be there's really the Etzem Perish is not a problem, but someone tampered with it a lot, and that person messed up. He says, but what is the Rashi? This edition from this Ephraim Kufafer is the real Rashi. And he just understand, even though he was Talmid Chacham, but he had this ability of picking up all these types of things. He's legendary in various aspects that he had this type of chush, and he says it's real Rashi. And then he says it would be a great schus if someone went ahead and reprinted the Shas and did it on the side with this Rashi. That's what he says. Another Chashav Talmid Chacham that comes to the same conclusion, also tremendous Baki Talmid Chacham Niflo, who's still alive, Rebbe Chaim Sefer. He also says Kuffer's edition is the real Rashi. So now, if you want to get a hold of a copy of Kuffer's edition, you could go to Hebrew Books. They have it. It was printed by Machon Mekitzin Damim. A different time, maybe we'll talk about it. Okay. Art Scroll, Shas, and Oiz V'Hadar Shas, on the side of their Gemara, have a Rashi Miksav Yad. What's the Rashi Miksav Yad? The Kuffer edition. The only difference is, Art Scroll says in Agdama that it's from Kuffer, Oiz V'Hadar doesn't. I don't know why not. Maybe early editions Oiz V'Hadar did. I'm not sure. A friend of mine told me that he wrote to Reb Chaim Kanievsky about that he saw in a Gemara that used Kuffer's edition without thanking him, and it gave Hakaras Hatayt to Reb Chaim Kanievsky. So he had some type of taina to Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Chaim Kanievsky wrote to him, I have nothing to do with the decisions, what goes on in the printing of the Gemara. But the point is that these Gedalim, these Chashava people felt that Rashi is from, that the Kuffer edition is Rashi. Yeah.
Amazing. Wow. Just following the history of how this evolved is fascinating. But isn't the Art Scroll print? Is the Art Scroll print edition Oiz V'Hadar?
Yeah, but they write.
They just Art Scroll.
They have some type of deal. I don't know what the deal was. Yes, it is from Oiz V'Hadar. The difference is, but they write Hagdama. They both write Hagdamas, and they thank. That's the whole difference. Okay. Anyway, the story. We're reaching to the conclusion because of time, but I just want to ask three, four more points about it. So you would think 1961, this guy proves it. He proves it very well, and Rebbe Chaim Sefer deals with it, and what's his name, and Rav David C. Hillman. You would think it'll be finished. The story's over. No, the story's not over. Of course, various people check in depth. At least 3-4 different academics went through this be'iyun, and they came to the conclusions it's not. And okay, fine. Then a work came out, mamish in this is in 2007. A fellow from Bar Ilan went through this sugya of Rashi and Moed Katan be'iyun. Mamish, every tag shabbatag of Rashi and the manuscripts. He comes to the conclusion this kuffer is 100% right. But he proves it, and obviously time will not allow to go through it. His name is Yaakov Fuchs. An excellent job proving beyond the shadow of a doubt that Rashi on the side, which if you're using Art Scroll or Oiz V'Hadar called Ksav Yad, or you could go to Hebrew Books and get the actual thing, Kufafer, it is the real Rashi. And he deals with all the issues that were raised over the time about Rashi on the Masechta. Just to mention, two last points. One that he deals with is as follows. They made someone found in the late 70s a major discovery of, people always want to know how the Talmud was printed and when was it first printed. So I mentioned to you the dates that I mentioned was 1480s and then the 1520s. Was there any other editions? So it seemed this was called a bibliographical mystery. They didn't know, and then suddenly in 1970 they knew something, but they weren't sure. And then 1979, amazing discovery was discovered of a bunch of fragment pieces of pieces of Gemara that were printed in places in Spanish countries, in Spanish places that were not known up till now. What was interesting is that this is in the 1480s, and it might even been the earliest printing of the Talmud. Just we didn't know about it because they mamish were almost all destroyed, because right then these Yidden in Portugal and everything, they were chased out of their land, so almost everything was destroyed. Miraculously they discovered stuff. What happened is these Gemara pieces that they have, some of them have Rashi on the side, and it turns out it's very daima to the Kuffer Rashi. So we say there's further evidence that this Rashi existed, and the Italian printers, the Heiner Sensino and Bramberg, when they printed it in the 1480s and 1520s, they didn't know about this Rashi for some reason. But anyway, okay, this was a discovery based on works of a fellow Chaim Dimitrovsky, And this Yaakov Fuchs deals with it at length. Now, just to end this thing, this part of the discussion, there's a fellow Yosef Keller. He put out a Rashi on Moed Katan, also based on Kufr and more. It's also available on Hebrew books. His Rashi. And the last point about Rashi, to conclude with this, because it's just very interesting, I reached out to, there's some academics in Bar Ilan that have made some incredible, I call it science fiction programs, that they are able to identify, it has to meet certain criteria, but they're able to identify works. Sometimes we're not sure if it's a certain work. Sometimes a tshuva of the Rashba could really be it's the Ramban. They have a whole sophisticated computer program, and it has to meet specific criteria, as I said, but to identify if it really might be the Rashba, it might be the Ramban, and they, through these tools, they have been able to identify some things. Not everything are they able to. So I asked them, could you check and what's the story with Rashi and Moed Katan? So they spent a lot of time trying to, based on what they have, because they didn't have in the computers, in Word and in their computer system, they didn't have the Kufr edition, and they don't have all the things, but they did conclude that it's not conclusive Rashi on Tainus if you compare it to other Maseches, but there are certain things, certain characteristics that only appear in Rashi Moed Katan and stuff like that. This is a fellow Moshe Kopel and Avi Schmidman. They were very kind enough to run this through their programs. And Mir Hashem, eventually taking all the tools that are out there and the conclusions of about Rashi, such as, let's say, this Fuchs fellow and others, eventually we probably will be able to come to a more accurate, based on computers also, of various Masechtas, if it's Rashi or not. Okay, Ad Kan, as I say, just a very bekitzer. I apologize for so short about Rashi on the Masechta.
Beautiful. Really, really fascinating. Okay, so let's move right along to the Reshonim. I'm sure there are some of the classic Reshonim, not that many Reshonim on Moed Katan. So what could you add?
Okay, so first I'm gonna throw out there very fast. We'll go through this very quickly. Number one, a lost Rishon that seems to have played a major role in the Reshonim. This was brought to my attention by my uncle Rabbi Spitz. Is the Ravid? It's a lost Rishon. You check into it, you'll see that the Ravid appears to have written on Moed Katan, and Reshonim had it and used it a lot. Just not, which is not so. Let me say that Rishonim that normally quote the Ravid quoted is one thing that you'll find even in this Masechta, but you'll find even the Taisus Rush quotes the Ravid something like 75 times in this Masechta, which is unusual. But we don't have the Ravid. It got lost over time. Why that is a different story. Okay. We'll discuss some of the Rishonim. We'll discuss in part 2 when we talk about Avelis. But let's the Chida. I referred to last time. The Chida is a list of what's the Rishonim on the Masechta, and he lists out in different Masechtas which Rishonim. Moed Katan, he lists you one Rishon, the Ritva. Okay. Now the Ritva wasn't so common. Already I found that the Hamek Sheila is Miyashiv, that someone asks a kasha, the Bach asks a kasha on a smack. And he says if he would have had the Ritva, he would have realized it's not a kasha. But even the Ritva wasn't so common. Also, interestingly, there's a Taisus Rid, which is printed in the 1860s with Chashav Askama the Shalom Eshev with Ha'aris. But even though the Chida uses the Rid a lot, I don't know why he didn't mention it on this Masechta. Okay. So at this point, if we're going and we're focusing on the 1860s, already up to the 1860s, there's literally almost no Rishonim on the Masechta. What changes? What changes is in the 1930s, something happens, and a bunch of Seforim suddenly come to print in 1937, I believe. What happened? So many people have heard, there's different Machons. Today, everyone hears Meiser of Koch and Machon Yerushalayim. An early Machon, which still exists and does still put out stuff once in a while, it's called Machon Harry Fishel. So this Harry Fishel, he was a Gvir. He supported a lot of institutions. In the 1920s, he came to Eretz Yisrael and he funds a building of a beautiful house and Beis Medrash for Rav Kook, which still exists till today. In the 1927, he realizes he only has daughters. There's not going to be a shame. His name is not going to have a future. He wants to have a kiyum of his name for the future. He has a meeting with Rav Kook, and this is 1927. They come to the conclusion they should open up an institute for Torah to train people, that they'll also put out works, etc., etc. Okay, Rav Kook heads this organization. They build it. They have a bunch of different people come from all over to try to join. They pick out they pick out from, I think it was 50 different people that tried to apply. They pick out, after extensive testing, oral and written. There was 102 applicants. 52 came back for the oral. This Harry Fishel wrote a part of an autobiography. And Mekitzer, at the end, 18 people pass. These people end up working in the Machon. And fine, he discusses at length about it. Okay. Now, 1935, so this Machon's going on for a few years. 1935, Rav Kook is very, very sick. It's right before he dies. He realizes that they're going to need someone to run the Machon. So they hire the very well-known person, Rishol Lieberman, and Rishol Lieberman becomes the head of the Machon, and he's the person in charge. And they continue working on different projects because Rav Kook was not able to, he was very sick already at the time. Now, when Rav Kook, we know already from the few years before, Rav Kook, when he created this Machon, they had outlined a bunch of projects, and there's even a Sefer HaYovel that came out, L'chvoid, one of Harry Fishel's visits, discussing all the projects that Rav Kook was working on and others were working on until Rav Kook died. Okay. Rav Kook dies. They decide to put out Seforim, a Moed Katan, from manuscript that didn't exist up till now. The first Peirush that they put out is a Meiri. It was never printed on Moed Katan before. They put out the Chedushei Haran. They put out a Taisus Rush. And then they put out a Sefer they call it the Shita L'Talmud Rabbi Chil Mi Paris. Okay, so basically what happens is, and in one period of time, the people of this Machon, funded by Harry Fishel, in the year that Rav Kook is nifter, footnoted and everything, they put out these 4 Reshonim. They're all available on Hebrew books, and they've been reprinted a few times with footnotes done properly based on the manuscripts. So already in one quick year, you got 4 Reshonim knocked off. Okay, 1957. A fellow Rabbi Mirsky puts out a Rimalonil, another Rishon, also on my cut. So you already got a few more. So far in the 50s, you're already able to learn more. Okay, we fast forward to 1966. Machon Talmud Yisraeli puts out a bunch of Rishonim on my Katan. They put out, just to list them, they put out a Rabbeinu Gershom Meragayla. Turns out this Rabbeinu Gershom Meragayla, relating to our discussion earlier with Rashi, that's going to fit into that whole story. We won't get into it. They put out the Taisus Rid based on manuscripts. So although I mentioned Taisus Rid was printed, but they redo it. They put out a Likutim of a Sefer Aner, a Talmud of possibly a Talmud of the Rashba, and some other material on the Masechta, a nice fat volume on the Masechta. I think it actually might still be available for purchase. So basically, the world of Rishonim suddenly in the 60s explodes. And one last thing, just to mention, as far as 2021, the Kavitz Yerushalayim, someone prints an article based on manuscripts of Rabbi Chilmi Paris Moed Katan. I had just mentioned that Machon Talmud Yisraeli printed something from Rabbi Chilmi Paris. This is another Pirish. This might be actually him. That might be a Talmud, but they're from the same school. Anyway, bottom line is, Ad Kan, Rishonim, there's more Rishonim. We're just mentioning some about them on the Masechta. That's the story for Rishonim for right now.
Rabbi Eliezer, after you finish giving these historical backgrounds and all the proliferation of Rishonim, I feel like Daf Yomi are going to need more time of their day to start learning the Ian.
Baruch Hashem, that's the idea. That's the idea.
Okay, fine. So now that we're going to have more time in our day to learn Rishonim, maybe we'll find a few more minutes to learn Achronim. What Achronim are there? What are the modern day Seforim?
Okay, so we'll do this very fast. So first, we've already discussed on Tainus that there's a Sefer, a Chashav a Sefer, one of the Gedolei Achronim, the Karen Eira. So he also has a very thorough Sefer on Moed Katan. Another Sefer that's written really on Shas, but he has a nice amount of Moed Katan also worth mentioning is his name's Rabbi Yehuda Epstein. He wrote a Sefer called Minchas Yehuda. He was zeicha to learn Shas b'chavrusa with the Nachas David. He learned in Volozhin, but he was rich, and he was also at some point he learned b'chavrusa Shas with the Nachas David, which is a remarkable thing. Nachas David is a Talmud Muvik of Chaim Volozhin. This sefer is fascinating on many different fronts. But what's important for us is it talks about Moed Katan. I believe it's available on Hebrew books also. Another Litvish sefer, not much is known about the author, is a sefer called Taisus Aaron. It's also available on Hebrew books. Very unique sefer, has very chashuv askamas of Litvish contemporaries of his, and the sefer is unique because he was also into Kabbalah, and he also had great Havana in areas relating to astronomy. He also has a little bit on Rosh Hashanah he talks about. Anyway, he has a nice amount of Moed Katan, a nice sefer to check out. And then there's last two achronim of achronim before we get to more contemporary. Number one is a sefer called Ksainis Pasim. Ksainis Pasim was written by a great Gaon, also a Volozhiner, Talmud. And this great Gaon, his name was Rabbi Yaakov Mipadua. And he was prolific. It was a chashuv Talmud of Rabbi Chaim Volozhiner. And he wrote on the Nemuke Yosef, because it's the Nemuke Yosef on the side in the back of the Rif. So some people say it's actually the Ran, and a lot of Maseches there's always a big tumult. Is it the Ran? Is Nemuke Yosef? And that's its own big discussion. For Moed Katan, he says it's a Davar Pashut. He wrote a whole sefer on various Maseches of the Nemuke Yosef, calls it Ksainis Pasim, and he says as a Davar Pashut that the sefer on the back of the Gemara it's the Nemuke Yosef, and that's also available, also on Hebrew books. Now, just to mention with him a fascinating a story I recently put together like this. There's a book, incredible book. Growing up in yeshiva, my Rosh Yeshiva, Reb Zelig Epstein, was very fond of quoting this book. It's called Hagadol Miminsk. This is how it looks. It's a book about the Ar Gadol, the Minsker Gadol. Now, what's significant about this book, it's not like most Gedolim books, is that the author was a Talmud Chacham that knew his subject, the Minsker Gadol, well. He lived in his house for a few years. He was the Malamed of the Minsker Gadol's Minsker Gadol's children for a few years. Some of them ended up becoming tremendous Talmud Chacham. And the book is full of unbelievable insight and stories about Litta and other things. And here he has a story about the Minsker Gadol when he's very young. And he's a tremendous Baal Kishron. And he's learning in shuls. He was learning in various shuls, and he was very let down. He was, let's say, 10, 12 years old, and he felt that the Mahalach Halima that people were learning, but he didn't like it. It just wasn't talking to him. People were breaking their heads, spending full days learning the Marsha, and a line in a Taisus or something, and he didn't go for it. And his father was nervous. His father wasn't a Talmud Chacham. And his father was very nervous, so he brought him to this author of the Ksainis Pasim, and he brought his son to him, and he had a whole conversation with him. And he said to him, and the Minsker Gadol, in this book, it records this whole back and forth that he had with the Ksainis Pasim. And the Minsker Gadol says that sometimes you can have a conversation with someone that's a game changer for the rest of your life. This conversation that he had with this Gadol, the Ksainis Pasim, changed him. And what he said was, in short, it's written very well, as a side, besides for the book being an excellent book and reliable, it's extremely well written. It's so well written that the author was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. Sometimes it's very hard to even understand his language, because the author was a Murdik, a Baki in the Hebrew language. There's tons and tons of footnotes. They had to give it out to tremendous Talmid Chacham to figure out what it meant. Anyway, make a long story short, what was the story? What does he tell this young Minsker Gadol, he wasn't the Minsker Gadol at the time? He says that sometimes it's true, you shouldn't break your head the whole day learning a Marsha, but it's still important to learn that's how you open up your mind, so to speak. You have to spend some time on let's say the Marsha as an example, because after you get familiar breaking your head with the Lashon, then later on it will be much easier to learn it. And then there are many important ones, but so there has to be like some middle ground, but you have to spend time on it. And he says, let me show you an example. He pulls them out in Nemuke Yosef. He says, look at this piece of Nemuke Yosef. And so the Minsker Gadol says a pshat. And he says, no, it's not true. He says it's a good pshat, but if you understand the signon, the lashon of the Nemuke Yosef, which I'm now telling you, he was the author of the work on the Nemuke Yosef called Ksainis Pasim, you'll understand not, and he shows the Minsker Gadol, and the Minsker Gadol, and he convinces Minsker Gadol, and then whatever. Okay, the rest is as they say, is history. Okay, one last work on Masechtas Moed Katan is a sefer called Maseches Moshe. This work is also by Litvish Gadol. This Litvish Gadol wrote many svarim on Masechtas and Shas. His name was Ramoshe Betzalel Luria. He wrote on Sukkah, Moed Katan Yavamas, and a bunch of other Masechtas, prolific. He also wrote a sefer on the Rekanti and the Tashbitz. In manuscript, he left behind a sefer on the Parnas, which only a few years ago came out via Machon Yerushalayim. They finally printed it. Now, the Maseches Moshe was printed after he died. His son printed it. It was printed in 1924. Just one fascinating piece of information that the son writes in this Hagdama. He says, my father was a very gifted Talmid Chacham. It seems he was a very big, smart Bal Kishrin. And it seems that in the town where he was, the Maskilim got to him, and he was he was learning with them already, and and it seems they almost got him. And I guess they told him he's going to be a great professor. Something happened, and Baruch Hashem, he left, and he ended up going to Volozhin. He ends up learning a Volozhin. He ends up having to do Rubitz Katan, and he gets a stellar, and becomes a great Rav and a prolific writer. And what's interesting, you always hear about certain people. They say about different people, they had some type of story. They have some type of story with what's his name? With Haskalah. Here's one that his son is writing about him, and he successfully won, and he became the great Gaon and prolific writer. Okay, now just to conclude very fast, is that Masechtas Moed Katan, people always complain we don't have I don't mention contemporary Seforim, so let's just fast mention. First, there's a sefer Ha'aros of Reb Elyashiv, very, very good. There's also a sefer of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Shiurim and notes on the Masechta, very useful. Another sefer is Magidim Chadashim. I happen to enjoy the sefer a lot, but Amir Tzashem will discuss him more when we get to Masechtas Chagiga, Bli Neder. And now, to conclude, the contemporary topics of the Masechta. So the Meiri already writes, which people know very well, the Masechta deals with Chal Moed and Avelis, and then Shvius gets mixed in. So for Chal Moed, just to mention, not to go into, just to mention it, I don't want to get shot over here. Number one, the Sefer on the Masechta, which I believe ArtScroll recently reprinted it, but it was printed in the 70s, in the early 70s, or in 1981, from Rav David Zucker and Ramosha Francis, called Chal Moed. ArtScroll reissued it. It has tons of, it was always considered the Sefer on the Masechta. Not the Sefer on the Masechta, and the Sefer on Hilchas Chal Moed. Also has very reliable psukim, many psukim from Rav Moshe and from the Debretziner. Okay, that's one contemporary sefer on the Masechta. On the topic of Chal Moed. Another sefer is the Kutei Halachos on Chal Moed from Reb Shapsi Vidiger. Also another important sefer. Another sefer to mention is Rav Yukasiel Farkas wrote a sefer called Chal Moed Kilchasai. And there are many others. Not to take away from them, I just can't list them all. And then, as Chal Moed and related to this Masechta, there's controversies like everything else in halacha. So just to point out two svarim on that. One is shaving on Chal Moed. Everyone knows, a big tumult about it. So there's a beautiful sefer from Meir Ben Yo called Giluach on Chal Moed. One last sefer relating to Chal Moed is a massive sefer. Seeing is believing. So they say it's this fat. It is. It's called Sharshay Minig Ashkenaz. What is it about? It is 916 pages about the topic of wearing tefillin on Chal Moed. Fascinating topic. Also relates to our Masechta, the Rayas, some of the Rayas. Okay, fine. Now, that is the Svarim relating to Chal Moed. I'd just like to conclude, because it gets in the Derech Agav, and because we're in the year of Shemitah, I'm not going to speak about Barichos. I feel we have to list them, some of them. Basically, a few Shemitahs ago, I walked into a Seforim store in Eretz Yisrael, and I said, how many Seforim are there out in Shemitah? He said, they just began, and we have over 75. And this was not even a big Seforim store. Today, if you go into anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, Seforim come out every other day about Shemitah still, and they're still coming out. I'm not aware of any recent bibliographies collecting all this, just to mention. Because it relates a little bit over here, so for me, I'm in Eretz Yisrael, it's Shtickle and Yana D'Yayma. I'm just going to spend 1 minute listing some names. Number one, Ada Yoim, one of the best essays is an essay from Rozevin in Lar Halacha. It just gives you a background. From the classical Seforim, Rav Kook's Mishavas Haaretz, Aruch HaShulchan HaAsid, the Chazon Ish, the Pasas Shulchan, there's an edition that has the Ridbazes Ha'aris, very important. Of course, we can't go without mentioning the Madani Ards of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Incredible sefer. Of course, at one point it was printed to change it a little bit, and then it was to kilo kasher it up, and then later on it was more released in the proper edition. Fine. Derech Hamun of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, it's being learned here, Yom V'Layla, everyone, and it's an incredible work. You have the works of Kalman Kahana, we have the famous sefer Shemitah from Rav Tukashinsky. Of course, it goes on and on and on. Contemporary and new works keep on coming out. They just recently put out a Rav Yosef Engel sefer. They reissued the Hart Tzvi from Tzvi Pesach Frank's material. Rav Avad Yosef. They made a new edition of all his Peirushim on Shemitah. A friend of mine, Rebellia Greenswag, they also just collected his essays on Shemitah. And to conclude about history, about a week, a new sefer that somehow it has some connection to me is supposed to be coming out from manuscript of Rav Reinus on Shemitah that was never printed before. And just to conclude with history, there's an excellent sefer, 2 volumes so far from Boaz Hutner called Ubashana Hashvias. Looks like this. It's a fascinating 2 fat volumes on the topics of Shemitah. And also there's the essays, it could be found online, of Eitam Henkin Hashem Yinkam Damai on the topics of Shemitah, available to read and get some information about it. That Adkan part 1 on my Katan.
Wow, amazing! And you're not going to mention any Shemitah controversies, or we're out of time.
No, we're out of time. So I already stuck it in Derech loophole. So to go into it out of safe, Adkan.
Okay, Yasher Koyach, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. Let's look forward in the next week or two on the edition, specifically on Avelos. Everybody, continue learning Moed Katan, don't stop, and we'll hear what Rabbi Eliezer has to say on Avelos.